So my next topic, and I changed the color scheme. You see what I did there? Is an update on CWE usability changes. So this is a topic that is important and obviously a good dovetail from our last subject. One of the challenges that we've seen in terms of CWE and its nexus with the CVE program is around its usability. And I want to talk a little bit about that today. So I'm going to give a general overview of the background of what's been going on in the past and the recent past, talk about some of the working groups that are really trying to move the needle on this, and then a status update on where CWE usability efforts are currently. So in the background, generally speaking, for many years, really, and I might actually go back a little bit further and say, the CWE program is a little bit younger than the CVE program. It goes, harkens back to around 2007 or so. And it was really built out of the idea of the CVE, what we were seeing in the data of the CVE program over time. And we were saying, oh, well, we're seeing a lot of, sort of these kinds of vulnerabilities, for lack of a better word at the time. I think they were called vulnerability types. And the idea was, well, what if we start tracking these things to understand the root cause sort of mistake that can be manifest in a variety of products? Like, you could have a particular problem that is done in, a mistake in the code, let's say, that could ultimately become manifest in countless products, right? Countless browsers, countless applications, but it's the same inherent flaw. And that's really the background to CWE. And for a very long time, the whole idea was, well, let's build out this dictionary of known weaknesses as they became to be known. And it wasn't necessarily the idea of let's making this the most usable project and information on the internet. And when you go to the website, you can imagine that being the case. But now there is considerable recognition around the value of this information. And so we're within the CWE program, we're really trying to enable those throughout the community to better use CWE as part of its vulnerability management activities. So for many years, as I'm getting back to this bullet now, we faced community feedback saying, okay, we don't know where to start. We don't know, how to use CWE information. The hierarchy is very complex. The website sucks, all those kinds of things. And so what we did was, as an initial step, is set up community working groups really in response, who's been focusing on different activities to improve the usability at different levels of CWE. And we've already got some tangible improvements that I'm happy to share. The CWE program, though, overall is really working to address these usability and understandability challenges in further ways from both the structural level, the whole website, the sort of search, the engagement across, usability angle, but also within the individual weakness itself, right? The language. And we refer to these, I said it at the beginning when we were talking about it at micro and macro levels, probably not the right term for this kind of stuff, but that's what we stuck with. And so I mentioned working groups. There's really two working groups that are, sort of one very focused on this and one sort of similarly focused, but less immediately across the entire program of CWE. So the user experience working group, which is led by Rogue at Red Hat and Chris Coffin from MITRE, and many of you will know him from CVE as well. This group meets monthly and is working to identify areas where the CWE content and rules and its guidelines and best practices and all things must improve to better support its stakeholder community, right? And then we work together to fix them. And we've got some great outcomes from that thus far that I'll talk about next. The other one that's more recently formed, if you were at VulnCon, we talked a lot about this at a panel, and that was the root cause mapping working group. And this is a really exciting one because for the first time, it's bringing together the CVE program community stakeholders and the CWE community stakeholders, which to date really didn't necessarily come together to discuss sort of the relationship between these programs in a workable solution way. And so this group is really fundamentally established to improve and scale the idea of using CWE as a means to better understand and correlate CVE's records with their root causes. And so those are that meets biweekly currently, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on there a little later in the presentation. So I mentioned initial improvements in terms of CWE usability. One of those things, I'll highlight a couple of them, and then we'll get to other topics as well, is that we can now filter, rather anybody can filter CWEs based on specific information that they're looking for, right? So any entry that you go to in CWE, you will see at the top there's a couple of default entries depending on what your interests might be. They have conceptual, which is sort of the high level sort of concepts of a weakness, operational, which gives you more detail and sort of down in the weeds, some code examples of that weakness, for example, mapping friendly, sort of self-explanatory and complete as well. Most importantly, perhaps, is that there is also a custom filter, and you can sort of filter on whatever you really want to focus on related to CWEs. And that setting that you choose will apply whenever you navigate around the site. So you don't have to keep doing it every time you go from relationship weaknesses to another. One of the other things, and I should say both that one and this one came directly out of the user experience working group, is that we have mapping labels and notes now. So it was also on the previous slide, but basically under every single title of a CWE, you will see not only the ID, of course, but you will see vulnerability mapping in a little link and a label. And those labels are very specific with the idea of trying to help enable really useful mappings for the community, right? And by useful, we mean we don't want to be mapping necessarily to something that is correct, but very, very vague, right? The idea of like, oh, okay, well, this is an input validation problem, right? We have a very high level entry for that conceptually, right? From a research perspective, it's important to understand what's the high level topic, but not necessarily the specific kind of weakness in play. And it's more actionable, right? And better from a mapping perspective to map a CVE, for example, to a root cause that is much more specific, right? So looking at what we typically say the base or the variant levels of CWE, but for today, I won't go into the details of that. Understanding just the idea of being a little bit further down in the tree where you're talking a little more specifics means more actionable, right? And so what you'll do when you go to an entry, you can click on that label and it'll take you down to the notes, and it will give you some information about that CWE and why it's designated as it is, right? So when you see something like discouraged, you're like, well, that doesn't mean I can't do it, but why shouldn't I do it? If you go down in there, it'll say, okay, well, here's the reason why this is discouraged, right? It's kind of high level, it's kind of vague. Here's some others to consider, right? If it's a problem related to this, you might want to map to something like that. If it's a problem related to something else, and there'll be a couple options for you to consider. So CWE usability really is in trying to improve across a number of ways. As I mentioned, we have the micro perspective, which is how to define a weakness concisely and accurately, right? So when you go to a CWE entry, you're not inundated, and you are sometimes, right, we recognize, with just a wall of text. And a ton of text to digest and understand is hard. In addition to the micro side, which is looking at those individual weaknesses, we talk about the macro side, right? So how can we improve site-wide search, for example, so people can get the information they want sooner and easier? The navigability, just the general nature of the site, is a little outdated. Its attack surface is very, very low, I can promise you that, but its usability nonetheless, or relatedly, I suppose, is something to be desired at times. So how can we better group? How can we improve the navigability of the site given our constraints around the infrastructure for the time being as we go forward? So when we talk about micro updates, I've talked a little bit about this, but part of it is actually the entry language itself, right? So we can look at revising CWEs to improve the language so it's more understandable, right? Part of that includes removing redundant language. So when we talk about the description of a CWE, if you go to them generally now, and at least not everywhere, but in the past, we would always have a description and an extended description, and it was a lot of text. And very often what you would see in those descriptions and extended descriptions is a lot of context around the weakness itself, right? And sometimes the context around a weakness itself, it would say things related to how the weakness is introduced. It would say things like, what are the potential impacts of the weakness? It would say things like, well, how do you mitigate the weakness? And all this was in the description. And one of the things that we're trying to limit is saying, well, actually, we're not trying to get rid of that information. We're just trying to better use the schema, because all of those elements belong in the schema in different spots, right? So we have an area that talks about impacts, and we have an area that talks about mitigations, and we have an area that talks about where the weakness is introduced. So we want to better use the CWE schema to address the wall of text and remove redundant information. Additionally, we want to focus on the high level. What are the most important things about a weakness, right? Now, granted, you can filter on whatever you want, but generally speaking, the idea is that we've talked with people and said, okay, yeah, the most important things really are a description to understand what the weakness is, what are its consequences, and what are its mitigations. And so we're working to basically change the schema itself such that those are the first things that you see. And then lastly, we're adding visualizations because sometimes, written text around weaknesses is hard. It's not a vulnerability, right? And discerning the vulnerability from the weakness language is a challenge that we talk about a lot. When you look at a title of a CWE, it's at first like, well, what the heck does that mean? Well, it's actually talking about things from the weakness mistake as opposed to the vulnerability. When you talk about something like cross-site scripting or SQL injection, right, which I have actually an example of this coming up, that term in and of itself is an attack. It's not a weakness, right? And so when we talk about what that is described from the weakness perspective, the flaw or the mistake, that's why the title is what it is. I'm just going to answer the comment that I see up here from Carmen Liu. What if there's no specific mapping appropriate for the issue found, so the discouraged CWE is the most appropriate? Can we still use it? So in theory, yes. I will answer this by saying that the CWE corpus is not uniformly complete across the board, right? What do I mean by that? Well, I mean certain elements of our knowledge in weakness information, right? If we think about buffer overflows, these have been researched and discussed for decades, right? We have a lot of information in there and a lot of specific things, right? So you can probably find something more useful than something that's marked discouraged. However, there's other areas, right? Just top of my mind, access control, other areas of the tree, the CWE writ large tree, I mean, where we don't necessarily have as much completeness in the corpus. And so that in that case, yes, sometimes you're going to have to use discouraged CWE. Again, there's a process to go through to determine that there isn't something else to do, but yes, you can use it. The other thing that I'll say is a perfect opportunity to plant the idea that we do want to hear from you if there is actually potentially a gap in the CWE corpus to say, hey, there's a weakness we need here because I've got the vulnerability to show it, right? And what we can do there is then we have a process around submitting information to the CWE program. And that includes, giving us just general overview. If you go to the CWE website, there's right in the middle there at the front, says something about, make suggestions or contribute to the CWE program. And we have a whole process for that. So I just plugged that real quick. All right, so I'm trying to keep us on time here. What this looks like in practice when we talk about a micro adjustment is before, right? Here is the site as we talk about it when we say the SQL injection entry, and that's improper neutralization of special elements used in a SQL command. Again, hopefully that makes more sense when I describe how we describe things in CWE. And what we have now is that, okay, it looks sort of similar, but what you'll see is that the description is much shorter, right? We have a visual aid to help understanding what is the actual mistake being made. And we go right into common consequences. And of course, the page goes on, but we go right into things like mitigations as well. And then you have all this other information that you may want to look at. The team is actively working basically from the top 100 entries that we look at from Google Analytics as to being the most in demand. We updated 15 entries accordingly using this new format back in June. We have another release coming out in November, which funny enough, is going to be primarily focused on the CWE top 25, but it will also have some of these, and we're going to continue working in this space. So real quickly on macro, what's included? Well, better organizing CWEs at structural site-wide level, right? Things like groupings of CWEs for similar domains, related weaknesses, the site-wide navigation, as I mentioned, and completeness, right? Which goes right in towards the question that I just answered. So one of the things that the group, or rather the program did recently is a data call around user interviews and starting to better understand really what are the key elements that we can improve from a macro perspective, from a show don't tell perspective, and I'll go through these really quick. Improving the search function, right? So what we have right now is sort of powered by Google, and it's just sort of trying to connect, information through a very complex hierarchy. And sometimes that's not conducive necessarily to finding a weakness, especially as I mentioned, understanding attack language versus weakness language, right? So if you're really trying to find something, you might be thinking, oh, well, here's the vulnerability language, and we got to figure out how to translate that better. So that's something. Considering which text is necessary versus unnecessary. Again, this is the show versus tell. And then we've got some user experience research and design next steps that are going to be taken both in those working groups that we talked about before. Okay, so improving search, I wanted to just call out one of these, and I have a little bit of time. I want to make sure we have enough for a break. So I'll just mention the root cause mapping working group is going through some iterative development with a community member who's making a grounded LLM tool for improving the interaction that a user can have with CWE information, right? So I mentioned that search in and of itself, as it is currently employed or deployed on the CWE site, is suboptimal for a number of reasons. And a grounded LLM tool really enables at least interaction with the CWE information in a way that previously wasn't available, right? And so this community member and the root cause mapping working group is working collaboratively to sort of give comments and updates on making this a reality. And where it stands right now is that there are instructions available. I put the link in here. I can put it in the chat as well for anybody to basically pull down all the CWE information, create a grounded LLM tool. There's actually a free version that you can do yourself if you have an account with some of the big, LLMs around like ChatGPT. You can actually build your own version and use your account to do that. The group, rather, I should say the program, is also looking at trying to incorporate these directly into the CWE program, but also potentially, and I think this could be a real game changer, is the idea of somehow figuring out how this might be implementable into clients for creating and editing CVE records, because I find the biggest use case is in that space where we say, okay, I'm trying to make the record. I know I need to provide a CWE. I want to provide a CWE. Excuse me, it's just really hard, or it's really time consuming. If we have a way that we can improve that, where within that, record generation tool, for lack of a better word, client, that we can incorporate a really quick, like, well, here's the issue, which CWE should I use? And you get a couple to choose from. That's, that would be a game changer, I think. And so that's what we're working towards, at least in my mind. And that really brings me to the end of my talk. So I didn't realize that was my next slide, but I wanted to save us time here too. I know there's probably a bunch in the chat that I have not seen. So, okay, nothing. Thank you all for being here. Really appreciate it. We'll be around, I think. So if there are questions, you can put them in the chat.